Welcome to this week's episode of the Deliberate Leader podcast. This week I'm joined by Professor Duncan Bentley, the Vice-Chancellor and President of Federation University here in Victoria. Duncan is also a past colleague of mine, and I couldn't wait to bring him on the show and share some of his leadership strategies, but also his learnings. Very, very humble gentleman who's always more than happy to share what he does with his team. I can't wait for you to get into this episode. I think you're going to love it. See you soon. Duncan, thank you very much for joining me today on the Deliberate Leader podcast. It's wonderful to have you here.
It's wonderful to be with you, Rita. I always enjoy chatting about leadership.
Me too. That makes two of us. Hey, I think we're in for a real treat today. I know in the introduction, people will get a sense of who you are and what you do. And I had the pleasure of working with you and really, being past colleagues. I learned a lot from you and from others at the time around leadership. And so I'm very excited today about our conversation. And I know that you're going to have lots of pearls of wisdom to share with our audience. So Duncan, the first question I like to ask, which is customary for the Deliberate Leader podcast, is, for you, that essence of a deliberate leader, what does it mean? What are the characteristics that come to mind for you when you think about deliberate leadership?
Well, I suppose the key thing is that when you come to leadership, it can be learned, and we're all learning all the way through our leadership journey. It isn't just something that you're born with. That's a false misconception that some people then count themselves out of a leadership role because they don't feel ready for it. They feel imposter syndrome. Well, we all do that. And you move into a leadership position, and whatever it is, whether it's taking on a new board role, whether it's your first management position, whether it's a CEO role, all of those things are incredibly challenging. And so it's important to give yourself the space to learn to be a leader, to really not rush into it and worry that you need to exhibit all the characteristics of a really experienced leader very early on, but to make sure that you are open, you're curious, you're deliberately taking time to understand who you are in the situation which you find yourself and how that will relate to the leadership role that you're undertaking.
Yeah, I'm hearing in that sense of self-awareness and really being able to tune in where you are, because we learn. I mean, you're so right. Leadership is a game of constant learning and being tuned in. What helps you, Duncan, to really be tuned in and to take those opportunities to become more aware of what you've needed to learn as you've gone through?
I think one of the most important things is to be kind to yourself. What I see quite often with new leaders, younger leaders, is that they're so desperate to fulfill the responsibilities to which they have been called that they leap in without taking the time just to soak in the environment that they're in, to understand themselves and how they are then reacting and positioning themselves in that situation. Because I think something that Terry Agnew, who was the CEO of 𝗟𝗲𝗿𝗍𝗶, said to me was, it's really important to take time for yourself, to take time out to manage your time and your diary and not be managed as a new leader. And you also need to look after your leisure, your sleep, because that will make sure that you are on the top of your game coming into what you're doing, and always giving time for thinking through the broader environment, because often as a leader, that's what you're bringing to the role, is that you need to have a view at the next level of what is happening in terms of external factors and how that will impact on how you lead and what you lead. It's also really important to really get to know and understand the culture and the values of the organization in which you're in, and how your own personal values, hopefully you did this before you got into the position, but making sure that your personal values are absolutely aligned.
Yeah. You know, Duncan, the thing that I find with personal values is that most people, and it's always surprising to me, think quite late in life about their values. And it's not to say that they don't have any, but in my experience, people don't really connect in with them. There's very little that we're doing, for example, with kids in school, or even our leaders, emerging leaders and leaders that are new to leadership, around what are your personal values. How have you connected in with your personal values over the years? Is it something you've always known, or was there a particular, activity that you did, or a particular mentor that helped you really to connect in with what those personal values are?
So I was fortunate in that from a young age, I've always had a strong spiritual dimension. And so that's helped to inform my approach to life, and just understanding the importance of right and wrong. And I grew up in Africa during a time of civil war, turmoil, apartheid in South Africa. I was actually in East and Central Africa, but I went to university in Cape Town, where apartheid was coming to an end. And so there was this deep focus on what it was that was important in terms of values. And I went on to study human rights law, and it always had a significant impact on me, and led to my career path out of a more finance-based career, which I ended up in because there weren't any jobs in human rights, into academia. But I think universities, where I am, are incredibly strong places where we need to be absolutely espousing the values and principles which we want to see in society. And so just by having always subscribed to a strong value-driven, principle-based approach, and I brought that to my leadership, and each of our my leadership groups, I've encouraged to have what are our trademark behaviors based on the values to which we all espouse. And it's amazing how bringing those discussions together has been so important in really helping people to articulate, as you say, what their values are, to ensure that we are aligned and have the courage and trust to be able to talk about our values and stand up for our values and call out values which are not appropriate, so that we can build the trust and collaboration and commitment. And I found that incredibly powerful.
Often with values, I think what we find when teams work intentionally and deliberately on exploring their values at a personal level and then doing that alignment is that there's more similarities than what there are differences, across a team. And I think it gives language so people can say, well, integrity means this for me. The other person shares, well, it means this for me. And so I find that it tends to bring people together and certainly develops a different level of understanding around what's important, what we stand for. And as you say, that compass, around what's right and wrong. In situations where people find that they are in conflict with the values of their organisation, what would you suggest that they do? Because sometimes those personal values might not align to the organisational values.
What I would tend to encourage in leadership teams is adding to what you've just described, to actually come up with scenarios which test the values in live situations, because then that will help people to come to grips with why their values might not be aligned, but actually to have those conversations early on. So if you look at the example of the current situation in Australia with anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, we've got disputes on welcomes to country, LGBTQIA+, just the polarization we see in our community, it's really useful to articulate what are some of the things that you might face in your organization and how would your values shape your response. We see this also with corporate social responsibility. And so some of the bigger corporations, with the changes in the American environment, have opted out of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, they would argue probably that those principles are imbued into what they do anyway. However, you've got to be very clear before you make public statements on that if you espouse one thing and then you change your mind. So it's much better for a leadership team to be able to go through some of the scenarios which they might face in their organization, and every organization will be very different. If you're a chocolate manufacturer, it's very different from a university versus a consulting firm. However, all of those organizations will face challenges to their values and principles. How does the leadership team respond? How do we want to coach and train leaders all the way through the organization to respond and live the values of the organization?
Yeah, and that's a really practical approach, Duncan, I think, around that. It's almost scenario planning, as we would engage in, scenario planning and testing for other things like critical incidences. When these kinds of issues that you've described, like particularly with some of the sentiment that exists in the community across a range of those issues, it is almost like dealing with a crisis, because you've got such polar extremes. And with an organisation like yours, Federation University, based, multiple campuses across Victoria here in Australia, there is also that sense of the university being part of the community. And so then it's not a little microcosm or an organisation as you would, maybe, have another organisation, maybe a more corporate organisation that kind of can do its own thing. You're very much part of the community. So often that community sentiment is being represented within and by the university.
Sometimes the community sentiment or certain things which take place in the community don't actually align with what we believe in. And I suppose that's the example where you can't be a bystander. You have to actually stand up and make a commitment. And so we're very proud to have the National Centre for Reconciliation, Truth and Justice, and we've committed to the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Now, the voice referendum brought a lot of polarization in the community. We're going to come through further polarization in Victoria with the treaty coming into play. And so for us as a university, where we have to make the campus safe for everybody to have their views, and it doesn't matter whether you oppose, whether you are passionately for, everyone should feel safe and no one should feel in any way intimidated from putting their views. And I think that's the same in any workplace. We might be an extreme example because we are absolutely there as a beacon for challenging status quo and new ideas and allowing the discussion of ideas passionately. However, in any organization, everybody should be deliberately allowed to come into the workplace and to be safe, whoever they are, whatever they bring to the workplace, because that's who we are as an Australian society.
Yeah, it's a big job, I think, and unless you've got the perspective of being and leading, a university, it can be hard for it to be understood. Duncan, you've spoken at length about the importance of values, which cannot be underestimated in terms of defining what kind of leader, what kind of leader you are and what kind of leadership team you have. And to that end, I guess, when you're, with your team now at Federation and with other teams that you've led in the past, what characteristics and capabilities and qualities do you look for when you are assembling a deliberate team to lead, a strategy and vision?
I think one of the most important pieces is to ensure that you've got diversity of views, because it's through that diversity, that ability to challenge, that you're able to innovate and keep the organization moving on a trajectory. You've got to have a composition of people who are strategic, people who are incredibly pragmatic and will often be the black hat in the room to say, oh, well, let's be sensible about this. Let's be pragmatic. How are we actually going to do that? And that brings the dreamers like me. I love strategy. I love seeing the future. And I need people who will make sure that I'm down to earth. And I have to be, and we all have to be open enough to be able to accept the strengths of each of the members of the team that they bring to the organization. And I mean, we see it in boards with the skills matrix, but in addition to the skills and capabilities which make up a team, and they'll be particular to each organization, you definitely need within the leadership the ability to articulate a vision which is very clear, which is aligned to your values and principles, because we have to inspire people to get out of bed in the morning, to want to come to work and to be part of something which is going to make a difference. And you might say, well, sometimes, it's really hard because how do you do that for jobs that some people might think are mundane? But actually, just this morning, I was talking to our gardening team, and we are having great fun planning, as they were showing me their plans for how they were going to create these beautiful spaces where staff and students would love being, simply by completely changing the landscape. They are passionate about students, the learning environment. So it's the ability for everyone to see the vision of the organization, to buy into it, and whatever they're doing, to have that deliberate and intentional way of participating. How can we as leaders help each of our teams to make sure they feel a part of this special thing that we are delivering?
Yeah, I love that, because you would think, and this is an assumption for those that are not so familiar with universities, but you would think that your gardening team or your catering team or your building maintenance team might not have much to do with students. But the reality is that they're probably seeing students walk around campus every single day, seeing them utilize the spaces that they are taking care of. And to me, there's a real clarity there of purpose. It's like, what are we all here to do? And that is to provide the best learning environment we can for these students and our staff and the community that we serve. It reminds me of something I heard recently on another organization. It's actually a cancer hospital for children in the US. And when people were interviewed, staff were interviewed, in terms of what's your purpose here, what's your job, the ward clerks and the patient care associates didn't say, well, I wheel people around on trolleys or I bring them food. They were all critically linked to, we are here to address children's cancer. And it was a sentiment that was held across every single member of that organization, irrespective of the role they did. And when you said, when you reflected on your experience with the gardening team, it reminded me of that. We're all tuned into the community that we serve. Mm. Yeah, and I think that comes down to what you said before, that really strong strategy, the really strong vision, and making sure that everybody sees how they enact and play that out. Duncan, sometimes, as deliberate as we may intend to be, as leaders, sometimes situations change and we've got to adapt our approach to a situation. What are your thoughts on how leaders should navigate this need to be adaptable and responsive, but also staying true to their beliefs and their values? How do the two things work so we're creating, this symbiotic relationship with hopefully not too much conflict?
I suppose I might be the wrong person to ask this question, because every leadership role I have taken has been all about change and transformation. And to my mind, the world is going to throw multiple things at us. So there've been in the press quite recently a whole lot of issues around artificial intelligence. And for some people, it's the absolute nirvana. For other people, it's the end of the world. But let's just take a practical example of student assessment. How can we be sure that students are actually being assessed now on the skills and capabilities and learning outcomes that we want for them. And it goes to how can we be sure that research papers are genuinely the research papers, etc. But that's just symptomatic of the current state of change we're in. I mean, I am old enough to remember being a very young worker when the internet came in and emails, and we were programming computers. Then there was e-commerce, and that was completely changing the world. I mean, every day there are changes which happen. With COVID, we went online in 3 weeks because we had to. And so in some respects, it isn't a case of how do we manage the leadership characteristics to cope with change. It's a case of, in a world where everything is changing so rapidly, how do we ensure that we don't become sclerotic and blockages to change, but always as leaders are, on behalf of the people we lead, embracing the change, being curious, but also being very deliberate in approaching decisions, not reactively, but calmly. It's amazing how it's a bit like the old adage that never send the email late at night after you're really cross, or especially if you've written it in the middle of the night when you've woken up. There is almost always time for calm and reflection. If there isn't because there's a major accident or whatever, there are very clear methodologies and tools that we have in place for critical incidents which we respond appropriately. In most cases, reflection, calm, and just taking time to breathe and allowing the team to come together and to address the different angles before you make a deliberate decision is really important in the face, particularly of the most difficult change.
You talked earlier about, almost leadership being a lifelong learning lesson, and that, leadership can be learned, I think is what you said. In terms of that calm and steady approach, which I couldn't agree with more, is that something you feel that you've learned along the way, or is it something that you always possessed in terms of that calm approach and that really thoughtful and considered approach?
I've become much more adept at applying it. I think that Professor Linda Christensen was one of the calmest and most comforting leaders to be with in a crisis. And I learned a huge amount from her. So she was a critical cancer care nurse, and so was used to responding to emergency situations from her training. And she brought that into the leadership. And I think that is the skills that those who are dealing with emergencies have are tools which are well worth reflecting on in an ordinary leadership, non-critical care environment, because it allows you then to avoid the triggers. I think also that we need to be very self-aware about what are the things that are going to trigger us. What are the external factors that will impact on me? And do I know myself well enough that I'm aware of those triggers so that I can catch myself behaving erratically or differently from the norm because I have a trigger, an external trigger, or which will cause me to behave in a certain way? Is my leadership team suitably, I suppose, self-aware that we're aware of each other's triggers and that we can support each other in that time, in those times, and make sure that we reach a deliberative conclusion which actually takes into account that we're all humans, we all have different perspectives, and those will influence the way we behave. Because the real importance of that is that if we have a very strong and trusting and collaborative leadership group, it then allows us to understand the impact also that we have on others and the rest of the organization, because that can't be underestimated. And I think that one of the challenges for leaders who've been in leadership positions for a long time is that you do become far more narcissistic and egotistical, and you've got to have a critical friend who's always telling you to come back down to earth and yeah, let's get real here. That's you going off on your own ego trip, and that is fatal to a leadership group.
It's so right. I mean, you highlighted there the importance of self-awareness and being tuned in and being able to really realize our own triggers and know how we respond. And I think sometimes we, as leaders, we can get into a situation where we can't see it for whatever reason. You know, it might be the nature of the issue that we're dealing with, or it could be stubbornness or even our own egos getting away. And I think that critical friend that you talked about is so important. And it's the culture of the team being able to go, I've got you. So even though you might not be having such a great day, but I'm going to be that person that will highlight for you, hey, I think you might have not handled that in the best way. You know, if you had your time again, how would you handle that conversation? Or what can I help you in terms of repairing that situation? I think when we know that we can share that accountability, not that we're not accountable, but we've got a friend that can assist us with that, I think it certainly helps and it strengthens the trust in the leadership team also.
And one of the things I learned from Professor Jane Den-Hollander was the courage and the don't be afraid to be wrong. We're never going to be right on everything, but unless we are courageous leaders who challenge the status quo, we will always be constrained by the bars of risk aversion around us in a cage which prevents us from fulfilling not only our own potential, but the organization's potential. And it's quite useful then to, I found that having been in a number of situations which were threatening to the sustainability of an organization is really good, because it takes a little of the traditional breaking off you, so that you can imagine what it would be like if you actually broke through the paradigm within which you find yourself into another future, which could actually be far more exciting. It's worth testing, but having that courage to do that, but also, as you said, having the team around you who've got your back, who hold you back if you get silly or go off in the wrong direction.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And it's the courage, it's creating the right environment for psychological safety, which is now, you know, in our jurisdiction here in Victoria has come into play. And that is about creating that right environment. So people know, you know, as you said, don't be afraid to get something wrong and owning it and admitting it, but then also being courageous enough to maybe even share the learnings with others, because that is where we, you know, often in leadership, people see us as infallible and, you know, with very high expectations and standards that they can't possibly reach. And I think when we are sharing those stories about this didn't go so well, or I'm not my proudest moment, people learn from that. And they also learn that is what they can do with their teams. Yeah. In terms of lessons learned for you, Duncan, you know, is there a time, you know, that you can recall where you've received a really memorable piece of advice that's helped you and it's been critical and you know, pivotal really for you in defining your own leadership style?
Probably not a single moment, but I suppose one of the interesting things in terms of a trend, which I found very interesting, was the fact that if you look at staff surveys over a time, depending on the traditional surveys where you go out once a year and you ask everyone how they're feeling, etc. What I found really fascinating, which helped to shape my leadership approach when you're looking at trust and collaboration and these really important areas of building your leadership team, is that the responses will generally say that we love our team, particularly in a big organization. We hate management, and we really don't like or trust that team over there. And it really is a trend which seemed to pervade for a couple of decades surveys. We've now moved away in many cases from these approaches to asking people, but it really crystallized for me the fact that building the local team is often something which is really easily done, but it's actually making sure that you create an environment as a leadership team which allows you, particularly going back to your point about adaptability, to move across silos, to come to institutional-based solution making, which really goes, I suppose, to the agile methodology and those sorts of approaches. But in so many traditional organizations, it's very hard to do that. You might have small teams who do that, but how do you build up the different layers of the pyramid? So at each pinnacle of the pyramid, you're not actually just advocating for your own team and you become little tribes, but you become part of a broader community where you are embracing the vision and you start to build up that trust that those people over there are also passionate about the vision. You might have a slightly different way of approaching it, but actually we need to build up the trust within the organization and to live out those values that we talked about in the beginning. So it all comes back to the same sort of principles we're talking about, but it was those surveys which really triggered in me, why is it that we have all these vision statements, we've got all the values, and we're also subscribing to the vision and the fact that we trust and respect and everything else each other, but the surveys say, oh, no, we don't at all. And so how do we turn it on its head with a really deliberate leadership approach which can address those issues?
Yeah, I think what I've seen over several decades is that, particularly at the executive level, if they are not joined up on caring about each other's segment of the overarching strategy and they're only interested in their own little vertical and slice, we do see some of these behaviors evolve where, you know, they might say the same, you know, or they might say the right thing, toe the party line, but then when they go back to their own team, they're like, oh, we'll do our own thing, or we're actually going to do it this way. We're not really going to take into consideration what our colleagues over in this team or that team might make of our approach over here. And I think it comes back to that shared vision strategy. And for me too, it's the elegance and simplicity and clarity of the strategy. So it can be well understood, well digested, and implemented by anybody, because it's not cryptic or too long or, or inaccessible. Mm. Yeah, it's that.
And one of the other things which can help to put that into practice is I actually like mixing leaders up. And so the traditional thing, particularly in a university, is you'd never put someone from a particular academic discipline in charge of another. And I've always found it quite fun for particularly senior leaders to mentor a different department or faculty or whatever, nothing to do with their expertise, but they can bring those sorts of experiences and that leadership capability into a different setting. It helps them to really expand their capability, but it also mentors people in other parts of the organization who are shocked that someone from another area actually understands what they're passionate about, and it helps to bring the organization together much more effectively than if you leave everybody in their own silos and hierarchies, etc. It's nice to mix it up, because then the organization can often flourish as a result of that.
It's that classic cross-unit collaboration, which we often will measure in those engagement surveys that you mentioned. We look at to what extent are we engaged and involved, and to what extent do we care about what other areas are doing. So to mix it up, I think, is great. Is it well received when you do that?
Sometimes not. They absolutely hate it, but then soon afterwards they discover that the leader, they're learning so much from the leader, and the leader can actually imbue some really useful insights which enhance their working environment, what they do, and make them much more effective and better because they're coming with a totally different perspective. And yes, they've got to learn and get up to speed, but they come with very considerable skills which they bring into that part of the organization, which makes it a better operating unit.
Yeah. Duncan, my final question for you today is around the best piece of advice you can give to a leader listening in today, if they are wanting to take a more deliberate leadership approach for themselves or even on behalf of their team. We've talked at length today about values. What else would you advise them? What are your top tips around being more deliberate, but also having that courage and conviction that we've spoken about too in their leadership?
I think it's really important for any leader to really understand the organization that they are leading, or the part of the organization that they are leading. And because that then helps them to give life not only to their own values, but their own values in the context of the values of the organization, the mission, where the organization is going. As you were saying, if you're not aligned, really you shouldn't be in that position. And it's quite okay not to be part of an organization where you don't feel you fit, or you no longer fit. However, I'm assuming that if they've just become a leader, that they are absolutely aligned. How can they articulate the vision for their part of the organization, or as CEO, the organization itself, in close conjunction with the board or the governing body, so that you're absolutely aligned from the top to the bottom? How do you build that leadership team? And I think one of the things that is important as you come into a leadership role is that, yes, take time to assess all of the people in that leadership position. I would definitely support coaching as a group so that you can have a facilitated support for building the team as a team, because each team, every time you get changes, as you know. I mean, it's a lot of your work, but it's hugely valuable work, because having somebody outside who can support you through that discovery, self-discovery, and then how you lead and build the trust and collaboration to contribute effectively to the shared goals that you set is vitally important. And then making sure that you're continually learning and curious, because it's vitally important that you don't become all consumed on the internal and what you've got to achieve over the next 12 months. You've got to be ready for the change, as we've talked about, which is coming down the track anyway from your external environment, and being very curious and innovative. In all of this, it's really important to have the clear accountabilities and to make sure that you deliberately identify as a team what your areas of responsibility are, what accountabilities you have, and what you are happy to be held accountable with a mutual discussion with your leader for, so that you can all have your backs and you can stand in for each other when someone's absent. I actually don't like acting people coming into my leadership team, because it's a decision-making team. It's a team which is leading the organization. So if we've all got our backs, we don't need acting people. Yes, we absolutely build the next level down, but the leadership team is a leadership team, and I'm very strongly supportive of that being seen both by the organization, that it doesn't matter if someone's away, one of the others will absolutely be singing from the same song sheet, as you were saying earlier.
Yeah, I love that, because it is that ultimate faith and trust in each other. And even if we're not there to represent our area, it doesn't mean that our area is not going to be represented. It means that we're going to have all of our best interests at heart, because it's collective, and we're looking at this as a collective strategy rather than pursuing individual pursuits and those of our areas. Yeah, love it. Duncan, thank you so much for your time and all the wisdom that you've shared today. A really great conversation. Particularly what I've really taken away is that the personal values piece, and I think it's never too early to really connect in with what those personal values are and to spend time as a team, really bringing them to light. I loved your suggestion there about the scenarios and how, we can test those and really put ourselves through the paces. Are we good for our word? If we're going to say that these are our values and these are how we're going to respond, do we and will we in a scenario? So Duncan, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed it, and I'm sure our audience has also. Thank you.
Thank you, Rita. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Deliberate Leader podcast, where I had the wonderful Professor Duncan Bentley from Federation University joining us. Duncan is the Vice-Chancellor and President, and also a past colleague of mine. This conversation really delved into values, and in particular, your personal values in leadership, and what happens when they align or don't align with that of your organisation. We spoke at length about calmness and a considered approach, and really galvanizing the leadership team so they're on the same page when it comes to strategy, and we don't have teams almost fighting against each other and working across purpose. This is a really awesome episode of the podcast, and I hope you enjoy it as much as what I enjoyed the conversation with Duncan.